We separated it into people, process, and technology. And we did that because when I talk with service leaders and they talk about any sort of transformation or evolution or continual innovation that is taking place, they always talk about the importance of those three elements. So that's why we split it out that way. I didn't want to have the content be, let's say, just technology focused when we know that people aspects and process aspects are just as much, if not more important. Welcome to the Unscripted Podcast. I'm your host, Sarah Nicastro. Today, I'm recording a solo episode, and I want to talk about some of the best practices of standout service leaders. So, some of you are likely familiar that this year we did our first ever Future of Field Service Standout 50 Leadership Awards. We announced winners of those awards in October. And this was a process where leaders were nominated by peers and colleagues to have an opportunity for us to acknowledge the hard work that they're doing and how it's benefiting their teams, their organizations, their customers, and the industry. So we selected, myself and three other judges selected the 50 standout leaders. We announced that in October. And we also created a report with those leaders to share basically some of their insights on the current service landscape, different trends, different challenges, opportunities, et cetera. So the idea was to use the moment in time of acknowledging these leaders to also sort of pick their brain and understand their thoughts on some of the things that are relevant in the space today. So we did that through doing a survey with the 50 leaders. The majority of them completed it, not all, and they did so anonymously. And then we took a look at the results of that survey. There were obviously some more quantifiable based responses and then also some anecdotal responses. And we crafted that into a report that we published a few weeks ago. So I would encourage anyone that is listening that is interested in some of the perspective of those service leaders that we acknowledged through the Standout 50 to take a look at that report and read through it in its entirety. But I've also been creating some content alongside it because, quite frankly, there was so much that came out of the survey and the anecdotes that it couldn't all fit into the report. And so I've written some articles sharing some of the bits that didn't quite fit. And I also have some thoughts and opinions of my own on the findings that I couldn't necessarily get into in the amount of detail that I wanted to in the report. So the purpose of this podcast today is going to be reflecting on some of the things that I thought were interesting from the report that I think illustrate some best practices. So if you think about the fact that these Standout 50 leaders were nominated because of the impact that they're having in their roles, then it would make sense that they may be doing things in a way that leans toward some best practices. Certainly not true for everyone necessarily, but something that I was thinking about as I was reading through and analyzing the insights that we gathered. The other thing that is important to say as I get into sharing some of the tidbits that I want to share today and talk a bit about is this report and some of the information that we gathered is not meant to be representative of service leaders as a whole or the industry as a whole. One, the data set that we have isn't a big enough sample size to be representative of the whole. And also, these are people that were nominated as standout leaders. So they themselves might be looking at things differently or thinking about things differently than what we might be able to consider average. So it wasn't really meant to give a hard and fast look at here's what's going on in the space, so much as it was to reflect on the mindset and opinions and insights of the people that we ultimately acknowledged within the Standout 50. So with all of that being said, what I wanted to share today and talk a little bit about are some of the points that stood out to me that I would think point to best practices, things that seem to be working well for the leaders that shared these insights. So when we did the survey that was the basis for this report that we published, we separated it into people, process, and technology. And we did that because when I talk with service leaders and they talk about any sort of transformation or evolution or continual innovation that is taking place, they always talk about the importance of those three elements. So that's why we split it out that way. I didn't want to have the content be, let's say, just technology focused when we know that people aspects and process aspects are just as much, if not more important. So that's why we looked at things across those three categories. So I'm going to kind of go through them in that order as well. So when we look at some of the points in the people section of the report, one of the things that I thought was interesting is 48% of respondents have reflected on hiring criteria and updated job descriptions in the last 6 months, 22% in the last year, and 26% in the last 2 years. I think this is notable because almost 50% of these leaders have updated job descriptions within the past 6 months. That seems significant to me because I would say not too long ago, for many organizations and leaders, that would be far longer. So I think it's a best practice that we are taking a look quite frequently at the job descriptions, how they're being received, getting some external input on what words or phrases or descriptors could be off-putting to certain folks. Are we casting a wide enough net, casting too wide of a net? And when you're doing that, that often leads you to evaluating the hiring criteria itself and thinking through, is this indeed a criteria or is it a outdated practice? Is it a wish list versus a have to have, et cetera, and making sure that those things are being reflected. The other piece of this that was sort of related is we asked about hiring criteria and related to whether or not folks are requiring previous experience. So let's see, 37% said that they require relevant but not industry-specific experience. 33% are seeking demonstrable skills and capacity for learning but have no experience requirement. 19% have created an apprenticeship or training program that allow them to bring in talent with no experience requirement and guide them through the learning process. And 11% are requiring extensive industry-specific experience and/or certifications. So taking a look at where this is at, it's obviously very mixed, but I do think this idea of the 33% who are looking for skills and capacity for learning, but not necessarily experience, and then the 19% that have created these apprenticeship or training programs. Again, in my opinion, that type of evolution is a best practice because we know that if we continue to look for talent based on previous experience, it just simply doesn't exist. We really need to be modernizing the approach, which often means that the organizations hiring have more work to do to get people ready to go out into the field on their own and be comfortable and successful performing those duties. But that is just the reality of the landscape that we are in. So I think the shift toward finding ways to take some of that onus on and bring people in that are capable but not necessarily experienced is, in my opinion, a best practice. We also, in the people section, had some different questions around employee engagement because we know that that's very important, not only to retention, but also customer satisfaction, et cetera. And the respondents shared some of the different elements that their organization has in place related to employee engagement. So performance reviews in the form of frequent one-on-one meetings and evaluations. 67% also have in place employee surveys. 61% have some form of formal recognition program in place to make sure that they are recognizing and rewarding the work that employees are doing. 59% have a continuous training and/or professional development program in place. 36% are focused on team building activities, so including things like organizing social events, team building exercises, investing in offsite meetings, et cetera. 29% are offering some form of flexible work arrangements, so allowing flexible schedules, remote work options, or other work-life balance initiatives. And 26% are providing mentorship and career guidance to help employees grow within the organization. So we know employee engagement is important. I think it's interesting to look at the areas where these standout leaders are putting effort and reflect on which might need some more focus within your own organizations, what is being done well, what aren't you doing at all, et cetera. So moving on to the process part of the report. What I thought was interesting here is really looking at, well, there's a few things. I would say the process section encompassed the most content because it covered sort of a wide range of things, including how customer expectations are evolving, how service delivery itself is evolving, how organizations are measuring success, how organizations are identifying opportunities for innovation, and how organizations are managing change. So there was a lot in there. What I think, or what I pulled out to speak about today, is a couple ways that we're thinking about how service delivery itself is changing. And so one of those, of course, is self-service. So seeing more self-service offerings and opportunities arising. So right now, the respondent said 15% have extensive self-service options in place and state that their customers are responding well to those. 52% currently have some self-service capabilities and state that it is a focus for them to expand. 19% say that they have some self-service capabilities and don't feel they need anything further right now. And 15% say they don't see an appetite or need for self-service. So again, the vast majority of folks here have some and or extensive self-service in place, and 52% are looking to expand that. And I think this is important just to think about keeping pace with what's happening in the industry overall. These offerings are growing in importance and prominence for a wide variety of reasons. And I think that where organizations really struggle with making progress here is in explaining the value proposition to customers. So companies that are used to a very transactional service delivery model can often really struggle with talking to customers about how self-service and what I'm going to talk about next, which is remote service, still hold value. So moving on then to remote service, 33% of respondents have transitioned a significant portion of service delivery to be remote, and another 30% are in the midst of transitioning a portion of service delivery to remote, while 26% use remote capabilities, but only for diagnosis versus resolution. And 11% state that they either have barriers to using remote capabilities or it's not yet a focus. So again, we have a big majority here looking at how to better leverage remote capabilities. And I think that is the trend, that is the best practice, thinking about just technological capabilities, thinking about the talent landscape, thinking about customer preferences, thinking about the ability to shorten resolution times, et cetera. I think that companies that are having a hard time seeing how this fits for them, it's indicative of maybe a harder time with change overall versus necessarily an issue with self-service or remote service specifically. So I would say that I'm not saying that all service should be self-service, all service should be remote by any means, but I think that looking for how and where those capabilities fit into your service delivery model is certainly a best practice. The other thing I thought was interesting in the process section is the focus on building a culture that is change adept. So 41% say that they have built a culture centered around continuous improvement and remain focused on change on an ongoing basis. 26% state that change management is handled on a project basis. 19% say change management is handled at the leadership level. And 15% state that change management is under-prioritized or not handled well within their organization. So again, we're going to see responses across the continuum, But this idea that 41% have built a culture that is centered around this idea of ongoing change, I think is very important. I've talked about this in the context of change management versus change leadership and what some of those differences are and what that looks like. And I think that in the world we're living in, this effort being put into how do we make change a foundational layer of our business? How do we avoid depletion among the workforce because it's change after change? How do we lead in a way that enables that? How does the company culture look when that's working well as how is change handled on a project basis, I think is really important. So we asked for some anecdotal insight on what change management strategy or tactic have leaders found that works best. And of course, the answers were a wide range of things, but including the workforce in developing the solutions and then implementing them, positioning change and the ability to change well as a competitive strength and how it helps us support our customers, establish an internal change marketing plan, and don't let up on the gas when you think that you have acceptance. Make sure you continue to execute all the way through. Over communication, leadership commitment, open and candid communication, ownership of change with every employee. So there was some good advice on how companies are making change a bigger focus within their organizations. I think the best practice is doing so. The how, there's not only one way to accomplish that objective, but we have to be good at continuing to change to be successful today and certainly tomorrow. Which brings me to the last section, which is around technology. And obviously, this is an area where there's rapid change, there's new capabilities all the time, there's increasing levels of sophistication in the tools that we can use. And for these leaders, they of course have to stay up to date on what's going on from a technology perspective, while also balancing that with the appetite for change within the organization, the way that it can augment and complement the people that they have or don't have, et cetera. So what I thought was interesting or best practice here is really just that these leaders continue to focus not on just introducing new technology all the time, because that's not the objective, right? But they focus on staying aware of what the possibilities are and identifying the challenges within the business that need to be addressed and then matching those things. So in the survey, 41% of respondents said that over the last 3 years, their technology investment in field service has remained relatively stable. 35% say it has increased moderately, 18% say it has increased significantly by more than 25%, and 6% report a moderate decrease. Looking ahead to 2025, 47% of respondents expect their budget to remain flat, while 35% expect a moderate increase and 12% expect a significant increase. So we see a stable, if not increasing, investment in technology related to field service, which makes sense when we think about the opportunities for more self-service, for more remote service, for more automation overall. And then obviously coming into the biggest buzzword of this year, and I'm sure next year, which is AI. So we asked respondents to share what their next area of focus would be in terms of technology investment for field service. Number one was AI at 47%. Number two, optimized planning and scheduling at 24%. Number three, remote service capabilities at 18%. And then number four was other at 11%. We also asked who is currently using AI within their service operations. 62% of respondents already are. And they shared some examples of how so, everything from chats and emails to triage and tech support, using AI to review customer equipment on material throughput to ensure they get best yield, service order summaries, document and data search, guided troubleshooting in a pilot phase, all sorts of different things that are already happening. Again, this is the biggest area of focus for companies going into 2025. That said, so I think thinking about technology from the standpoint of best practices is continue to stay aware of what the potential is and balance that with what the business needs are. Also, understanding what your next area of focus will be so that you have proper prioritization. But the other thing that I liked here is that while AI is the biggest area of focus for 2025, respondents also shared some of their concerns around the growing use of AI. And I think this is important to balance how we look at both the opportunity, but also the potential risk. So those concerns, the first is accuracy and bias, 33%. That we haven't yet mastered the basics and must do so first, 23%. Not having the data at the ready to support the use of AI, 19%. Security, 11%. The hype surrounding it, 7%. And keeping pace with technological advancement, 7%. So I think this idea of weighing what's available, how does it fit the business needs, what are the opportunities, but also what are the risks associated? How do we make sure that we understand those going in? What are some of the challenges we can expect? How do we prepare for those going in? So just having a very objective look at technology and the role it can play, I think is a really smart approach. So that's what I prepared to share with you all today. Those are some of the things in each section that stood out to me in terms of what it seems like some of these leaders and their organizations are doing well. There's a whole lot more great content in the report, so that I hope you will, if you haven't already, take time to read through it in its entirety. You can find that at futureoffieldservice.com. There's a standout 50 tab. You can look at the leaders if you haven't done so already, and also find the report there. And we also are planning some other content with some of these leaders, some to come on the podcast here and share some of their stories in a little bit more detail with you all, and doing some other fun things as well. So stay tuned for that and check out the report on futureoffieldservice.com. The Unscripted podcast is published in partnership with IFS. You can learn more at ifs.com. As always, thank you for listening.